Peace and power. It's your brother, Sobek. Now, we're going to talk about women's liberation or women's domination. Now, this is a chapter in my book called The Book or the Bullet, Knowledge of Self. So let's get into it. Is this women's movement about freeing women and equality, or a woman's takeover movement? Let's look at it. Let's first give some background, and we're going to lead up to what we know is now as the feminist or the women's liberation. Let's start off right here. The Ku Klux Klan, KKK, or simply the Klan, is the name of three distinct movements in the United States. The first began violence against African Americans in the South during the Reconstruction era of the 1860s and was allegedly disbanded by 1869. Allegedly. We don't believe that because we know that's not true. Alright, let's move on. After the emancipation of blacks in 1865, immediately two bitter white groups, the KKK and the Women's Liberation or the Women's Suffrage movement, were founded on the grounds of bitterness and resentment towards blacks gaining freedom and civil rights. Both groups are on record expressing their animosity toward blacks through either racial rhetoric and racial violence. The KKK unleashed 100 years of lynchings, while white women unleashed 100 years of false rape claims, both resulting in thousands of black men being murdered brutally and often. Okay? The racial murder case of Emmett Till attracted national media coverage as a result of a faulty sexual harassment claim by a white woman. Let's just be real. Please also note, feminism, okay, began in the Western world in the late 19th century and has gone through three waves. The first wave was oriented around the station of middle or upper class white women, involved suffrage and political equality. So we see the origins of this feminism movement did not even allow poor white women or just black women, period. It was all about classism, all right? Upper class women or middle class women, all right? So now that's a little background on the origins of feminism. So now we're getting somewhere. Now let's look at the civil rights movement. First, let's get some background. The African American Civil Rights Movement, or 1960s Civil Rights Movement, encompasses social movements in the United States whose goals were to end racial segregation and discrimination against black Americans. Let's stop. Let's stop right there. 1960s Civil Rights Movement goals were to end racial segregation and discrimination against black Americans. Racial discrimination, racial segregation. So we see that this movement was countering racism. Okay? So it was all about race. Let's read on. Against black Americans and to secure legal recognition and federal protection of the citizenship rights enumerated in the Constitution and federal law. So, protection against citizen rights. See? Something that was in the Constitution. Something that you were supposed to have. So you're not crying for something. You're not begging for something. You're not asking for something. You're saying, respect my rights. And the federal government should be involved to help secure these rights. So let's keep it in context here. They're not begging for anything. They're not asking for anything new. They're saying, what's up with these rights we're supposed to have in this Constitution? 14th Amendment. Alright? So now, let's move on. This article covers the phase of the movement between 1954 and 1968. Okay, so now we know that the movement was all about countering racism. Race, race, race. Let me plug that in your ear. So now, let's look at an action that stemmed from the civil rights movement. Affirmative action. What is affirmative action? Affirmative action. The term affirmative action required government employers to take affirmative action to hire without regard to race, religion, and national origin. Wait a minute. What you mean without regard to race? The civil rights movement was all about race. Had nothing to do with religion or national origin. It's all about race. Okay. In 1967, sex was added to the anti-discrimination list. Okay. Hold on. So this movement had nothing to do with sex. It was all about race. Who added sex? Was it black people? Was it African Americans? We'll find out. First, let's look at what is affirmative action. It's an action intended to promote the opportunities of defined minority groups within a society, to give them, give who? The minority groups. Let's start right there. What is a minority group? Is it just black folks? No. Let's read. One or more observable human characteristics, including, but not limited to, ethnicity, race, gender, wealth, health, or sexual orientation. Why is it not limited to race when the whole March movement was all about race? It should, anything stemming from this march should have been strictly limited to race, because it was all about race. No racism, no movement. No racism, no racism, no march. But now it's not limited to race. So now minority groups could be anybody. It's not just limited to black folks. Basically, that's what they're trying to say. When they say not limited to race, anytime you read not limited to race, that simply means it's not limited to black folks. That means other people can benefit from your demise at your expense. You was the one being hosed down for 14 years. 1954, 1968. You was the one being bit by dogs, police dogs. You was the one being clubbed down by police officers. You were the ones that went through 100 years of lynching. You were the ones who went through redlining, discrimination, segregation, oppression, suppression, name it. We were the only ones to go through these things. And you're trying to say any set aside is not limited to us? Other people can be included who did not march with us, who did not turn the other cheek with us, who did not sit at those restaurants and get their food spat in simply because they were black? Alright? So if you do find me some old goofy Caucasian to sit at the table with us, his food wasn't being spat in because he was Caucasian or because of race. His food might have been spat in because he was sitting with us. So that means if he don't sit with us, his food don't get spat in. So let's be very, very clear. So now we know minority groups is a bunch of garbage. It's a bunch of everybody in there. So now let's read it with that in mind. Affirmative action is intended to promote the opportunities of defined minority groups or everybody within a society to give them equal access to that of the majority population. So now this was a movement or an action for black folks because we were the only ones that wasn't equal. We were inequality. So this was supposed to give us access to equality. But it gave everybody else access to equality who was never complaining or never unequal. Alright. Educational institutions were added to the list of covered parties beginning in 1972. Pay attention to these dates when I call them out. So 1967 is when sex was added to the anti-discrimination list. The Civil Rights March was documented to start at 1954 and end at 1968. And now in 1972, education institutions were added to the affirmative action that was not limited to black folks, but to everybody who is classified as a minority. But the media, when it says minority, in their context, it's only about you. So it's a lot of word games going on. So now it can make a black person believe when it says minority, 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 or for only minorities, we think it's talking about us. We don't understand that minority is not limited to race, or code word not limited to black folks. Okay, so now let's go on. It is often instituted for government and educational settings to ensure that certain designated minority groups, everybody within society, are all included in all programs. So black folks, at our expense, at our demise, at our, just, oh my God, I can't even put it in words. Everybody gets the benefit now. So nothing is solely for us. Our church is being bombed. The KKK Dark Knights burn through our neighborhoods, nobody else's, burning the crosses, terrorizing us with Confederate flags, terrorizing us with American flags, terrorizing us, calling us niggers, lowlives, 3/5 of a human being, the Dred Scott case, the black folks don't have any rights to be respected by a white man. All this stuff is about us. But when something is passed in the favor of us, everybody's included. How is this possible? And who made this possible? Let's find out right now. Let's get into the women's domination. I know you guys are waiting for this. The women's domination. How did they dominate the Civil Rights Act? Okay. In 1966, remember, pay attention to these years that I present. In 1967 was what? That was when sex was added to affirmative action. So now we're going to see how that happened. In 1966, many blacks in SNCC developed concerns that white activists from the North were taking over the movement. So in 1966, many blacks felt like white Northern activists were taking over the movement, and a year later, sex was added to the affirmative action. Now, here we go. Several different studies investigated the effect of affirmative action on women. Curtulis in 2012, in her review of affirmative action and the occupational advancement, so this is job employment, of minorities, meaning everybody, okay, and women, so they separate women from minorities, during 1973 to 2003. So remember, in 1972, education was added. Okay, so the study was the 30-year study after education was added about affirmative action. Who benefited the most? Okay. It showed that the effect of affirmative action on advancing black, Hispanic, and white women into management, professional, and technical occupations occurred primarily during the 1970s and early 1980s. How the hell is Hispanics and white women tagged into affirmative action when it was an action that was supposed to be for those who were marching in the 1960s civil rights movement against anti-discrimination and anti-everything else against blacks? But now, let's see what the study shows. Becoming a federal contractor increased white women's share of professional occupations by 0.183 percentage points, or 7.3% on average during these 3 decades, and increased black women's share by 0.052 percentage points, or 3.9%. So white women 7.3%, black women 3.9%. So white women are 2 times as likely to get a federal contract over black women via affirmative action, an action that was supposed to be stemming out of the civil rights march movement that was supposed to be protecting blacks' citizenship, and it was supposed to boost us up and advance us in society. Some type of equality action that backfired, because now we see how the women's liberation took it over and dominated. Okay, according to the United States Labor Department, the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action are white women. Drops the mic. I dropped the mic right there. According to the United States Labor Department, the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action are white women. How did this happen? Women's liberation or women's domination? The Department of Labor estimated that 6 million women workers are in higher occupational classifications today than they would have been without affirmative action policy. So now, don't forget, the civil rights movement was about race, not sex. So now, not only is affirmative action helping out white women, but it's helping out women, period. What happened to the black men? So if white women are 2 times likely to benefit from affirmative action than black women, then where's black women? Then where's black men? That means probably black women are 2 times as likely to benefit from black men. Okay, so now let's look at the inner works of the takeover. Let's see how this actually happened. What happened? Well, remember the dates. In 1966, the SNCC felt like the white Northerners were taking over the movement. A year later, sex is added to the movement, to the affirmative action, and then because sex was added, now women dominated the benefits of the action, the benefits of the movement. Women's domination, white women's domination. Okay, in 1963, Betty Friedman published a book called The Feminine Mystique. Friedman's book struck a nerve. Within 3 years of the publication of her book, a new feminist movement was born. Do the math. 1963, Friedman published a book called The Feminine Mystique. Now this is equivalent to The Birth of a Nation. When the KKK did that video, that documentary, Birth of a Nation, and recruited all these Caucasians and these Klansmen to start that movement. okay, and to disenfranchise blacks. So now they did it again. In 1963, a book was published to spark this new revolution amongst bitter Caucasians. 3 years later of the publication of her book, a new feminist movement was born. 3 years plus 1963 is what? 1966. But in 1966, didn't the SNCC feel like white Northerners was taking over the movement? And then a year later, sex was added to the action? Women's liberation or women's domination? The likes of which have been absent since the suffrage movement. In 1966, Frieden, that's her name, Frieden, and others formed an activist group called the National Organization for Women. Now, that's their acronym. That's the acronym. Now, NOW, was dedicated to the full participation of women in mainstream American society. Okay, so they, now, the women's movement in 1966, demanded equal pay for equal work and pressured the government to deliver, to support and enforce legislation that prohibited gender discrimination. So this movement that came out of nowhere in 1966 pressured the government for equal pay, blah, 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 and a year later, bam, here you go. But black people marched, sang, died, brutalized for 14 years. All of us, 22 million black folks, couldn't, pressure the government to do anything for us. Right? This group, this Caucasian women group, 1 year it took. A small group of Caucasian women, nowhere near 22 million black folks, had enough influence and power to pressure the government within 1 year to put them, to tag themselves on some type of action, which they became the main beneficiaries of the action. Let's keep reading on. When Congress debated that landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination in employment on account of race, that's what it's all about. That's what it's all have ever been about. Race, not sex, not your finances, not your physical abilities. Race, not your education. Race, that's it. Conservative congressmen added gender to the bill. There you go. They did a gender. 1 year later, 1967. Okay, now let's see what happened after that. Well, the decline of marriage after the women's liberation movement. In 1950, the percentages of white and African American women aged 15 and over who were currently married were roughly the same, 67% and 64%, respectively. So, in 1954, before this whole civil rights movement, women's lib, all this type of stuff, the marriages between white Caucasians and African blacks were pretty much the same. We're marrying at the same rate in the mid to high 60s, or we could say mid 60s. That was in 1950. Dates, keep the dates in mind, write them down. Okay, 48 years later. So this is way after the women's lib, the women's domination movement, where they took over the march. They took over the action. The percentage of currently married white women had dropped only 13%. So they went from 67% to 58%. But the drop among African American women was 44% to 36%, more than 3 times larger. So this women's domination movement, this takeover, had kept their marriage, their family structure pretty much intact. They took a little hit, but you see, they always chalk it up. They charge it to the game for the bigger cause. It's all about you. It's all about you. It's all about destroying you. They'll take out a few of their own to destroy you. They drop only 13%. You drop 44%. 3 times larger. Let's read on. Furthermore, since only 1983, the percentage of women business managers and professionals grew from 41%, all of such persons, to 48%, while the number of female police officers more than doubled from 6% to 13%. Okay, this is according to the U.S. Department of Commerce, Bureau of the Census, 1995, Table 649. According to a 1995 study, there were at least 6 million women, the overwhelming majority of them white, who simply wouldn't have the jobs they have today but for the inroads made by affirmative action. This is COSE, C-O-S-E, 1997, 171. You can find that in the U.S. Department of Commerce, Bureau of the Census, 1995, well, 1997. Okay, somewhere in there. But it's COSE, 1997, 171. So, I ask you, was it about the women's liberation, or was it about white women dominating? Alright? The data don't lie. This is irrefutable evidence. Hope you enjoyed it. Peace and power, my family.